So I get started so we'll don't lose time. So it is a wonderful pleasure to welcome Beatrice Leong to our GEH network meeting this summer gathering. Beatrice is a Malaysian documentary filmmaker and a gender disability activist who believes in power of stories to name what others silence. When she was finally diagnosed with autism in adulthood after a lifetime of psychiatric and medical injustice, she began using storytelling to reclaim what was lost and connect with others who've been left out. Alongside filmmaking, she works across national, regional, and global spaces to advance disability inclusion, policy change, and narrative justice. And we met at the International Film Festival for Human Rights in Geneva, where she was presenting her upcoming documentary, which I really welcome everybody to look out for. Beatrice also serves on the advisory board of the Disability Justice Project, a media platform that supports disabled human rights defenders in the Global South through storytelling and advocacy. It's really a true pleasure, Beatrice, to welcome you. And I'm just handing over for you to speak today with us about the power of gender, data, research, and the politics of evidence. So over to you.
Great. Okay. Okay, Shireen did an amazing introduction, but I think she kind of like overinflated it. All I am is someone who really, 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 really likes story. And I also fall into the very stereotypical autistic trait of I really, really like collecting information and data. But what I wanted, and so in some of the conversation when I was talking to Shireen much earlier when we met, was also about what exactly is the meaning of data. And I'm going to assume that everybody in this network has some sort of work linked to data and within a certain research and academic network. And that is really only one point of data, which has had been a very huge point of frustration for me in the last 6 years or 5 years when I started to become a little bit more active in working on policies and also starting to look at like what exactly is how do you actually sift through information and data, and also to understand what does it really say. And on top of that, because of my own experience, I also start to map out and start to see that a lot of the things that we think are true has a lot of missing perspective. And that's also where as someone who works in media, I also get to see how we manipulate data and information to whoever who have the source of power. So at the end of the day, even I myself, when I used to do interviews for stories of other people, I also get to decide, which is, you play into the system of who do you interview? Is it someone who's available? Or is it someone who really has a story to tell? So that's kind of where I wanted to also frame this, where I didn't want to come and bombard everybody with a lot of data. So I've got really only 13 photos to share. So I've got 13 points to share, and that's all. And I wanted to also learn from other people also a lot about like how do you guys actually acquire data at the moment, because within the disability movement there is a dearth of data globally. It's very frustrating, but globally you don't see a lot of disability data beyond what disabilities that you have. And I always want to also say I always like stories that starts with I'm a huge Star Wars ghost. Okay, so you start to begin in every story. There's a beginning, the middle, and end. So where does data starts? Data is always personal. Data is not a subset of things that we often read that comes in charts. And for me, it all begins on like why do I look at disability movement? Why do I look at medical data? Why do I look at health data? Is because what is here is a lifetime of my psychiatric misdiagnosis. So I have had almost 9 formal psychiatric diagnoses from as young as the age of 10 years old, and they are all here. And I only began to start looking at what's in the detail because it's very hard to actually even access psychiatric diagnosis that belongs to you. And I'm 41, I'm not under 18. I should have my rights, but it took a long time to acquire this. So that tells you a lot about the consent of whose data does who's when you have a medical record like a psychiatric diagnosis, who does it belong to? So in a lot of countries, in fact, actually the de facto law, the de facto pervasive law is it does not belong to the psychiatric patient themselves. And this is a global phenomenon, and we will come to why it is the way it is. But my personal entry point is, like Shireen introduced me, I only got an autism diagnosis at the age of 35, which is about 6 years ago. And that doesn't mean that I developed autism. I've always had autism. I was born autistic, but it was missed out, and there were a lot of factors that comes into play. So it means that in 35 years of my life, no one had actually analyzed my data until I put it all together like this. And this is actually the highlights. My actual book is like a file tick. It's a huge binder, and these are all actually narratives of what happened, because every single diagnosis, it's one data entry point that's related to the DSM. I'm sure we are all aware of what the DSM is. The DSM is the Bible of all psychiatric diagnoses, which actually it does not serve the medical uh, industry. The DSM was birthed because of the insurance industry that that Americans need, so that they could do the payout and stuff like that. But that's a whole different topic. So all of that was then from my own psychiatric diagnosis was then mapped out into all of these different narratives. And when I began to study it, that's when my autism diagnosis came about, because someone else laid the data out for us. 35 years of other people's narratives about me, but no one had ever asked me how am I actually experiencing all of the different diagnoses that was given to me that had turned out to be it doesn't fit me. And what we have come to understand with the DSM, and this is where I say the power of narrative. When you are being diagnosed, and I'm going to use autism as a example, but it's actually true to all diagnoses and all criteria within the DSM. It is described by someone else over you. But what exactly constitutes a psychiatric diagnosis is actually what goes on in your mind. And there is no way in our current science or our current understanding of neuroscience, we have yet to arrive at a space where we can actually read minds. We can map out what lights up in our brain. We can map out thought process if that person could communicate clearly with clarity, and if they have enough language. I also always tell people that you can only describe your emotions or what you think as much as how wide your vocabulary is. So if I have 50 words that I've learned, I can describe my emotions within 50 words. But if I have 5 words, I could only describe it within 5 words. And that's where you start to see the inequality of narratives when it comes to psychiatric diagnosis. So that's why 35 years, no one had actually asked me what's actually going on in your head by asking me to describe my experience myself. So the power and the shift of it had always been the medical model had always had the largest power in deciding an identity of someone with a psychiatric diagnosis. Um, and with autism in particular, you need to meet five. You need to have some form of a degree between criteria A, criteria B, C, D, and E, and they're all describing not a physical trait or any form of physical or or any physical symptoms, but they all describe of a behavioral symptom that's observed by others. They're also being described of the social interaction as observed and presumed by others. and any other form has to be described by someone else other than you. Like one of a criteria for evidence of autism, it must be present from birth. They're not gonna ask you, have you experienced this as a childhood? They had to call someone else that's not you to help them verify a data point that is about you. So this is the DSM, and this is how we diagnose autism. The person that's being diagnosed from it rarely ever have a say within it. That's in general, but there are certain shifts in different movement where we are talking a lot more about autistics, right? So that's also where someone like me comes in, where we fight for the diagnostic criteria. The process has got to change. You need to be more participatory. It's not that I sit there and you ask anyone else in the room about me when I'm sitting in the room. That's literally how I got my diagnosis too. So that is where my personal connection with why the DSM, why am I fighting within the disability justice, and why am I fighting within the gender, and on top of that, the criteria that's often built, and especially for autism, 70% of what they have studied are white cisgender male, and we are still holding this research and this basis of this data set from the 1960s and 1970s that are still diagnosing us in 2025. Nothing has changed. There's no difference in, we had changed interpretation, we had changed categorization, but we have not changed diagnostical criteria. We have broadened it up in thinking that we have broadened it up so that people who have similar traits within the spectrum of autistic traits have now they're now under one category instead of, it used to be five. But that's also an insurance thing. It's not so much that. So like I said, as always, and this is where the filmmaker comes in whenever we talk about, and something that I want each of you to hold in mind while we explore later on over where are the biases, and something that I also want to throw at everyone later that I would like to have the discussions on. In filmmaking, we have many, many different roles. I don't know how familiar we are with filmmaking, but I'm sure we all have a phone. We switch on a camera. So we always have to ask, right? In films, one of the main thing we have to ask, whose voice, whose story are we telling? Who's holding the camera? Who are you shooting? Who's your character? And then after that, we also have people who decides who's telling the truth in a table of a character. So that's often happens when we have multi-perspective, multi-characters. Is Trump saying the right thing, or is Elon Musk saying the right thing when they're fighting like babies on X, right? So this is also who decides what counts as truth. And then the last in filmmaking, what you see on screen later on, that's not the truth. That's often what we worked on in Edit, where we had then, as filmmakers, crafted a story as someone has crafted the DSM or any form of cleaning up the data to be presented to show you what is the conclusion according to the hypothesis that I want to showcase with you. So, filmmaking and research and using data is actually not much of a difference. In maybe in science or maybe in biology, we look at hard data, we look at very qualitative data. In filmmaking, we look at characters as our data points. So they are our variables of what will change. And this is very, very important to think about when we talk about like whose voices shape the data. When we read a certain data, who wrote that data, who hold the camera, who wrote the pen, who fill in the form. You know, we often disregard contextualizing source of data, because we think of source of data as, is it digital, is it manual, how do we collect the data, or does it come from primary data, secondary data, or is this a report from a fieldwork? So how far removed are we from the source? So similarly, when we make documentaries, we also ask, are we able to take our camera there and shoot it ourselves? Or are we going to download it from YouTube and clear the rights? Or are we going to buy archival from the library? So whose voices? Because if I'm going to buy something from the British Library about Malaya, it's going to tell a very different story from what I'm going to find in artifacts in Malaysia. So that perspective also is very important when we look at data. Who are the authors? If someone's talking about autism in women, five of the authors are males. Where are they from? Are they from the US? Is someone Asian? And if it's Asian, is it Asian American? Is it Southeast Asian? We need to ask all these things. And when we talk about the lives of a queer identity person, is it someone that lives in the US with rights, certain rights? Right now, there's no rights anywhere in the world. If you're living in a Muslim country, do you have a voice in that generalization of a queer identity? So that helps you discern in a study or in a film whose story is it about anyway. And then who decide what counts as truth? And this is where, you look at like who works in this data, who had manipulated this data, who's funding the research. We often don't see who publishes this research. And I'm going to briefly say this. Nothing is I have yet to come across anything that's not funded with an agenda. Even within us who are on the right space, we have an agenda. We have a voice that we want to say, but how do we increase the equity and how do we balance the voices that we have? So that is also what we say when we talk about who decides what counts as truth, what counts as the main conclusion, or what counts as a concluding observation, who are we erasing in that process? So these are very, very important questions. Filmmaking, data, similar perspective. And this is the most important thing, and this is what Shireen was also sharing, that I'm making a film. And why data is important, like I said, there are so many perspectives. I'm making a film about myself and largely about my relationship with my mother. So I had a history of being institutionalized, which means that I've been put away in a psychiatric ward in and out for 200 and about 7 months in and out. And it's often at the period of 20 days. I've been in solitary cell and I've also been coerced into electroconvulsive treatment. Electroconvulsive treatment is a very, very invasive and a very, very archaic treatment that puts electricity wave to your head to help you, to supposedly help you recalibrate your brain synapses so that it sparks certain things, because in the belief that when someone has a certain severity of psychiatric symptomology, that they are unable to form thoughts, they are unable to form coherent emotional regulation, they're unable to have capacity in making rationale. So electroconvulsive treatment is a very, very contentious treatment. And when I was put away, I think I was 25, 25, yeah, 10 years ago. How old am I now? Oh, 15 years ago, sorry. So that was about 15 years ago. And I was an adult then, I was working. But the moment that I was put away, I had lost complete loss of legal capacity, because in my country we have this thing called a mental health law. If you are put away in a psychiatric ward for long-term care, you give your rights to decision making, which involve medical rights, which also involve certain financial and legal capacity right, away to your next of kin or an appointed guardian. And it's not a supported decision, it's a complete absolve of your own capability. So the film that I'm making is also about exploring with my mother, who consented to this. So my mother made this. My mother's not an evil person. Please watch the film when it comes out. But it's from a lack of knowledge. It's also from a lack of information. So we had 15 years distance apart. Of she was holding a certain truth, and I was also holding a certain truth. And my film talks about how both of our reality are very, very real, of she felt that her daughter had complete lost herself, while I had felt that my mother had put me away for good out of her life. And the film is about us meeting in the middle. So it's called The Myth of Monsters. So we are both that monsters. And why I wanted to say this, and also the what I've explained over this perspective and how a lot of the psychiatric diagnoses came about. My mother was the only perspective that had formed my legal psychiatric diagnosis that had been formalized in all institutions in Malaysia. So any public institution, any public hospital that I go to, the moment I put my ID card, they could come on an ex-psychiatric patient. There's a certain code that's to me. So to avoid a lot of that hassle and discrimination, I actually have to go to a lot of private services. But what I'm trying to say is that, but as much as I don't agree with so many things that had happened to me and the decisions that's been made about me, but it is true because it's factual truth. My mother did observe a certain behavior of mine. My mother was given a medical advice that was based on a universally accepted criteria from the DSM. That's factual, hard fact data. So those are her data points. But at the same time, I also own my own narrative and my own data point over, but my interpretation of my behavior was this. But my interpretation of what I was going through, what I was emotionally experiencing, was this. And they are also facts because I experienced it. It was not a hallucination. It was also not a figment of my imagination because they are thoughts. And if you are aware of a lot of what the right-based movement of people with psychosocial disability, those people who live with hearing voices like schizophrenia, or I think certain people who experience voices, illusions in their head as well, those are also facts of their life. They're not figment of imagination because they hear it, so it is a real experience. So at the same time, this is where these two truths met. And these two truths that had met will form what we call what's true. So truth and what is true is actually two very, very different things. And this is where, when we come to think, when we go back again to how do we form the criteria of a diagnosis, right? How heavy-handed it is. How do we arbitrarily give someone an identity today because we see that a person looks white, she must be white and she must be from America, right? We make that kind of judgment because we only interpret it from one perspective, and we rarely ever consider that there are two different sources. There are two different versions of this truth. So then, when we only formalize a certain interpretation, and in this representation of the story between my mother and I, you would see that my mother's voice had, and the medical voice, and that perspective had dominated what's true about me for 15 years until I start to articulate actually this is what had happened, right? So this is where inequality in perspective will form distorted truth. Inequality in having who actually gets the more pages to write, who gets more ink, who gets more money to post on Instagram, who gets more access to literacy, who has more vocabulary. And even within my mother and the medical officer who was advising her what was happening with her daughter, she has 50 words to describe a psychiatric observation. The doctor had 1,500 words to describe it. So both of them have two very different truths as well. And this is a conundrum that happens to each of us in what we experience, in what we see right now that's going on. What's happening in Gaza? What's happening to Palestine? Do we support Iran? Do we support Israel? Who's the bigger monster? You know, what's happening with China? What's happening in India and Pakistan? Whose truth are we taking side? How do we discern? Do we look at who's publishing this truth? Who has more vocabulary? It's it's a it's someone who's not living in a Muslim context able to tell you what's going on with the conflicts. If someone who's not Jewish is able to tell you the experience, it's not that you cannot co-opt someone, it's not that you cannot share knowledge, but again, source of knowledge, source of lived um, experiences. So that is a lot of what's happening, why we see a lot of distorted truths today. Because also one, there's a rapid information, an influx of information that just comes at you. Like every time I get up, my phone has 50 messages that I don't know what they're talking. I'm in WhatsApp group with 200 messages as soon as I get up, and I can't even browse until someone would tag me. So I only see what is caught to my attention. And when I'm on Facebook, right? Or when I'm on Instagram, there is a certain algorithm. I love BTS so much. All I ever see on my Instagram are Korean pop music. That's all I see. And that's what I choose that bubble to currently live in because I don't want to look at anything else. So that's also how we interpret data. And like I said, when we talk about who gives data, who becomes the source of data, that person has power. And it's similar as who has the voice. We often ask who has the voice. And when we think about how does sound wave resonates across, sound wave comes from the source, which is where you are, and it starts from a synapse in your brain. It's a thought, right? Or it's a reaction when there's two force that hit each other. So these are two very, very abstract things. Just as your thought process, they are very abstract, but it then converts through a process within your brain, within how neuroscience work, and it changes form into an energy. And in that energy, it will then reverberate in your throat from your stomach with air, with lung, and your body, how short you are, how tall you are. This all affects how loud you can be, how soft you can be, and then it reaches someone else, and that's who's listening to you, right? So if you compare someone who's malnourished, or if you compare someone with a disability who cannot speak, 35% of autistics don't communicate in spoken words. So they do not have that certain power. So on the other end of who's listening, what are the noises? What are the only data that they hear if that is the only way that you are capturing data? So, in the current landscape of how we are listening to experiences, in the current landscape of how we are collating data, in also the current landscape of how we are deciding who are we going to platform, who are we going to give the money to, is who are you hearing, right? So it's a very, very, it's a process of also how do we then discern that that is the only form of getting data. That is the only form of getting a perspective. If you do not consider that not everybody has the same amount of power to let you hear their experiences. And that's why it's so that's why any form of data source, any form of where the originating data on, you are so powerful because you sit within it, but the power often shifts to who has the energy, who has the resources to turn them into something bigger, who's funding media, who's funding academy research, who's funding the Lancets, who's funding the ethics board, who's funding the university, what are the agenda of the university, and where is the university, where is the research base, which pharmaceutical company is funding that particular study for a certain illnesses, for a certain drug push, for a certain vaccine that's ongoing. So that is the power of data. It's not just about what you see, and it really, really translates. And then I'm about to introduce to what's the flaw, right? And as you can see, like I explained, right, that if this is how we are looking at how data transfer to us who are doing the analysis, who are doing the policies, who are doing the storytelling, we are also at fault about. And these are the flaws that we see today. It's top-down design. Every single research question I have that I've participated in about autism had never been written by me because anyone that had come to me and say, could you help advise us on our research question, I would just say you shouldn't ask from number 1 to 10, just forget about your research, right? But look at what's coming out from institutions. Look at what are we asking people, and especially for systematically marginalized community. How long have you been discriminated? What is your disability? Can you tell us how difficult your life is? Can you tell us how do you go to the toilet? For a non-disabled person, how often do you get asked questions like that? I answer a questionnaire like that every time I get on a plane. They would ask me, do you have your medication? Do you know how to get to your seat? Are you okay to get to your seat alone the moment I show my disability card? And never before, it's so rare that this sort of questions are actually co-designed by us ourselves, that we become the subject of being studied. And on top of that, matrix over meaning had trumped us all because of the rapid need to produce data and to produce research. More than ever, every researchers in every institutions, even within the UN, even within all forms of the larger bodies of policies, research are your KPIs. How many papers and how many words you write are the very, very KPI of your performance index of, are you going to get tenure or not? Are you going to get this 13 months pay or not? Are you going to get 6 months? And we are chasing for that rather than actually dissecting actual lived experience data. So more often than not, when we look at people who we are studying, they become a footnote. If at all, they are credited. Other than that, they're subject A, subject B, subject 3, or one of the 43 participants. And the IRBs. This is my personal, it can be refuted, but the IRBs has often excluded disabled, gender diverse, or vulnerable groups. And I've seen this in all papers that have been sent to me. I do a bit of peer review. And we have a lot of skewed policy evidence, which I want to explore, and the very reason why I wanted to do this sharing today. And like I said, funding bias, data follows money. Like even when we talk about social media algorithms, a lot of studies that are going out, if you actually look at like their disclaimer on who's funding, on how they are also acquiring the data, you will see that a lot of them are being funded by Meta at the moment. Also, there's a lot of money that's going out in funding this. I think Spotify is also part of it, where they're actually listening to they are tracking a lot of different data that you are using to study your ethnographic rather than your musical but that's a whole different thing. So there is this, because and this is not to say these are all bad or whatever, but this is just what's happening at the moment, because you do need money to run research, you need money to write, you need money to edit, you need money to publish. But when you look at the scale of how much certain sets, or in a certain, like for disability, who's the biggest funder? Where are the biggest industries that are funding for? Or when you look at autism research, who are the biggest funders of what's happening with autism research at the moment? You would see that the money comes from only one particular organization. And there's a tool bias. Like I said, a girls like me, there's a little term that we are called the lost girls, because you're simply lost in data. Until today in 2025, the diagnostical criteria, the base subset has not changed from the first 40 autistic boys. No, I think there's 37 three girls, or I could be wrong, or four girls, but it's about 30 something. They are white male boys. The Asian users, I'm being assessed according to that, on top of everything else. right? And this is become a standard public health screening tool that we are using. The screening, we are using this diagnostical criteria, we are following the DSM, even in Asia, which actually means nothing to me. I often also tell people, if I live in New Zealand, my neighbor is 5 miles away, no way that you would diagnose me with autism, because I wouldn't be saying hi or talking to everyone else. I'll be talking to my sheeps, right? Or if I live in an Arab country, right, I wouldn't be looking at people in the eye. In fact, eye contact, which is often people say, you're not looking me in the face, you must have a social issue, so you must be autism. But guess who doesn't look at other people in the eye? People in the global south, the Asians, because it's rude for us, right? So there's a lot of true bias in this. And of course, that's where the gender perspective in. Look at those of us who live in Asia and what we look at the stereotypes of the girls that lived in. Oh, she's shy. She's not going to look you in the face. She's okay. That's normal. That's not autism. And you completely then bypass the probability of her being autistic, that she could have had early support. And then this girl goes on to fail in school, not being getting the right learning tools, not being the access support. So these are very, very concrete bias that we still see persist and very, very pervasive today, and they infiltrate in a lot of national policies, even in within WHO. In fact, actually, I just had a conversation yesterday with someone else. WHO only started to look at like a disability inclusion action plan last year, and it only started 2025 this year for them to start looking at what's happening in the global south. So now they're doing a lot of pilot studies with different countries to then roll it out. Before that, they had, please include them, but there was never an action plan. And disability movement had started way longer than that, from the 70s. So that's how long it had taken for people to realize there's a bias in tool. So that's where data, and of course, like the gender bias is very, very inherent. I put this book down because I think this is, it's a terrible read. I think she should have gotten a better editor, because she goes on and on, but it's a very, very good book. Invisible Woman really, really talk about the systemic data bias that's going on in the world, and you can see that a lot of special report on autism that had started last year from the field, which is what I'll highlight later. WHO guidelines. It's meant to be a public health policy to guide what global health is doing. But how often do we talk about disability within sexual and reproductive health? Like just the scopes that we had to do when we are doing your gynecological testing, there's a metal scope, right? There's only one standard size. What if you have dwarfism? What if you also have sensory difficulties? And what if you had like a shorter vagina length, but the medical system only provides for one size? And for them to have a different thing, it had to either they have a shallower scope that's made out of tools. So I have friends who would put rubber bands together, so they had like a different line tool that had to be modified, or they had to go to a specialized service. So you would see that, and guess what? 16% of the global population is disabled, and half of them, about 8 to 10%, are women, because women experience higher form of disability. They are more vulnerable to experience disability. So you have almost 10% of women in this world who are not getting the appropriate sexual and reproductive health, even from screening itself. Let's not even talk about medication, because medications that we have, PCOS and stuff like that, none of them had ever been studied. None of them had ever been meted out. Even the happy, what was the there's this vaccine for hepatitis. There's actually no disability data pool on how it affects someone with rare diseases, and they've only just found out in the last 5 years. Gender-based violence studies, rape kits, there are currently no standardized for disabled women, for women who have psychosocial disability. Off the bat, you are being asked questions. The moment that you do not answer the officers who does the rape testing kit with you verbally, they would assume that you are unable to answer and testify. That is written in the rape kit. Autism research, 80% of samples are male. Diagnostic criteria is based on cisgender, and on top of that, there is the Western gaze on the autism research criteria. Trans health research, people with intellectual or developmental disability. There are no ethics approved studies that we have seen so far. And point number 4 and number 5 is so closely related because they are not just a biological expression, they are also an identity and a gender expression, because almost half of those who identify with autism or a neurodivergence also identify as gender diverse. That's why it's very important to actually really understand why autism, especially with autism and the gender movement, why there is such a close relation, but yet people think it's causation. And all of this of what's happening in the last, I would say that research for autism had really accelerated, or the conversation about autism had really um, uh, had really accelerated in the last 6 or 7 years, and especially through the COVID period, where people then really, maybe because autistics are finally not being disturbed by the rest of the world, they could actually find time to like, hey, this is what's wrong with what you've written. So you start to see now there is a huge trend, and it's starting to trend in terms of there is a pattern right now where autism is often extracted as a point of a first crisis response. If you look at what RFK Jr. and what Trump executive orders are doing, of all the disability that he had chosen, they had decided that they will find a cure for autism by September 2025. This is their claim. So I'm waiting for this cure, okay? In case it improves my life for real. But there is a huge amount of money that's being pumped in there. And if you looked at a lot of what's happening in CEDAW, and a lot of conversations between workplace inclusion, between the DEI movement in the corporate sector, within the research money in neuroscience, a lot of them are skewed towards autism. And then we have this amazing report by the Special Rapporteur of Violence Against Women, Reem Asalam, who is very, very infamous among a lot of those who are. Uh, I, I hate to say that I don't like her, but can I declare that, oh, this is recorded? Yes, I don't like Reem Asalam very, very much, because I think she brings upon very, very dangerous thoughts in very, very important and sacred spaces. I don't want to give too much power to institutions like the United Nations, but there is power in such reports to inform of treaty bodies and to guide what will then be translated into national and regional policies, as well as international developmental money. So what she had recently said that she wants to go back to propose that gender be only exclusive for sex. You can only either be male or female, according to this report. I'm happy to, I'll probably drop this link of this report in the mailing list. The language that's being used in this report explicitly says that gender can only be male or female. It's a very blatant current pushback that is very much what we are seeing that's coming out of as an after effect of Trump's executive orders. And then you would see that those who are brewing the far right thinking, you would see that their language are starting to co-opt a lot of human rights language, because the report here also claims that if you recognize too diverse of the meaning of gender, then you are facing a moralistic failure. That's what her report says. And because of that, she had also made claims, in particular, that autistic youth have a higher significant co-occurrence of gender dysphoria, and they are particularly vulnerable to the socially contagious stereotype roles. So, of all the disabilities that are recognized, it is the autistic youth that she feels have higher rates of being trans, of identifying beyond their biological sex, and that is a social contagious stereotype role, which a lot of the academic has long disproved. So all studies, all data are now being rehashed. And then when we started looking, so me and a couple of different activists had started looking into where are the source of a report, you would see that she was taking reports only from one perspective. Organizations by persons with disability that are run by persons with autism that are run by parents, by other people other than the autistics themselves. And it is largely funded by Autism Speaks as well as ABA Technologies, which I will start to draw the parallels for you later. And on top of that, these are the particular line where she really zeroed out on autism and trans and gender diverse youth. And she said to address this issue, which she had said that it was a socially contagious and a moral failure of society, that state should fund support services for girls facing violence, especially for those vulnerable groups, including those, again, she had picked up autism spectrum, learning disabilities, and victims of sexual violence, and to allocate state budgets to prioritize them through and monitor outcomes. These are very soft languages. It seems as if it's not at is harmless. But what is actually telling you, if you look at the source of where she is drawing this knowledge and this data from, she is drawing from research that say, let's do conversion to them. Let's normalize them so they become socially acceptable again. And these are all hidden within the footnote of this particular report. We had tried to intervene with this report. We had tried all forms. We've went through different channels. We had also addressed it directly with her. But this report was actually presented as it is with no language changes and no further intervention on the 26th of June last month at the Human Rights Council. And it is now free for all, and this will start guiding. And she is the only special repertoire for violence against women. So it's it just quietly went up. So it's all there. There is a long-term plan of how are we going to go against this, but it's very hard because if you looked at what's in the report, this is where the data becomes very important. She did quote scientific data. She did quote published data. She did quote facts that were published, but we had never considered, or she had then never considered, who are the people forming these researchers, forming this data. So it is very hard if we also never publish from the other side, if we had never analyzed data and also to turn qualitative and lived experience into data points that we can then refute this. And this is where I say the power and the imbalances between who's giving the data. So this is actually what's happening on a very, very high level thing. And it's really just this year that this has started. And this has then fueled a lot of what's going on. Because if you look at what's happening in the UK is now claiming, so they put a lot of fundings. UK are also claiming that a lot of autistic youth have higher vulnerability to extremism. So far right extremism media movement is very, very prevalent at the moment in the UK. So there's a lot of curb over, let's not give this autistic kids tools that connects them to the internet, where for some of them this is their only social tool. So that's happening in the UK of the because of what's coming up on all of this global level policy of making the assumptions of um autism, extremism, and gender diversity. So all of this but it seems as if they are separate issues, right? But they are not. I always believe that if you want to know why things are the way they are, go back to the beginning to find out what's actually happening. Where did that data source comes from? So Ivor Lovas, if you ever meet this man, although he's dead, but if you ever meet him in your dreams, run really, really, really far away. Because he says about autistic kids, you start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person that's there in the physical sense, they have hair, a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping these kids is to see them as a matter of constructing a person that have the raw materials, but you have to build them. So ABA is the largest form of commercialized therapy and support for autism. Although ABA actually was never meant to be autism support, it's actually an analysis of how one behaves. It's a branch of life sciences, of applied behavioral sciences. It's organizational approach. But because there is so much money into people wanting to convert and it's so pervasive, because the narrative sounds so good, because once a person had never had a chance for voice, remember, no one actually ever hear from the autistic person. I am an anomaly. My community of advocates like me, we are tiny. We are so tiny. Our voices are almost never there. We live in a bubble if we think that like that is a truth that I really want to put it out there. But because the commercialized conversion, commercialized way of treating medicalized look at autism is so pervasive, right? It had then infiltrated, not let's not use the word infiltrated. It had then been co-opted by so many different policies, education, in within school, to then use what he had then structured into digestible formats to like, you want to help an autistic person, let's change them so that they can integrate to be part of you. So it's treating a person like they should be part of a factory line, that almost every human being is homogeneous. But why does he think that? So let's look back further on when did the queer community start getting their identity formalized, all the way up until 1899. Anyone who doesn't fit, anyone who doesn't love an opposite sex, who doesn't want to, is a witch, right? We used to burn them on stakes. And then it was medicalized because we would try to pull them apart, piece them together, turn them into Frankenstein. And up until, and then it was actually in the first DSM, um if you are gay, if you are queer, you have a psychiatric disorder, therefore you have to be treated. It was only taken away in 1973. Sorry, 1987, not too long ago, almost less than 30 years ago. And all the way to then, who's treating these people who were diagnosed with a queer identity? Iva Lovas is the same guy. And when it was taken away from the DSM in 1987, that was the birth of commercialized ABA for autism. So if you look, if you still think that what this had written, they are all siloed, they are not. The ideology came from this person to control the behaviorism and gender control, the belief that only certain identities, certain behaviorism fits into the mainstream. And that's why I keep saying it is very, 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 very important to understand, where is your data? Who's giving you this data? Who's writing that story of what's forming the ideology? They are not very far removed. And that is why every time when you look at what's happening, look at who's saying that we need to treat autism. Look at the histories of the Kennedys. Look at what RFK Jr. and his beliefs are. Look at Trump's and his beliefs are, and why he treats disabled people the same way, and why he makes fun of people with intellectual disability. Where are the roots? Trump doesn't look so different from Lobas, does he? That was a low blow, sorry. And then because of the history of ABA is so long and it's been converted from even before it became an autism therapy, we were also looking at like how people were treating queer, how people were doing conversion to normalize people. It becomes evidence-based. And it becomes so entrenched in our medical books that even today, what we are studying, please remember, whatever that you read in your medical textbooks today are written from 20 years ago. So you hardly ever get updated knowledge, right? So that's what we call evidence-based. And we keep holding this true that whatever we quote about any form of medical diagnosis, any form of psychiatric diagnosis, it must be evidence-based. But if your evidence came from this history, and then you use evidence in the modern lives of people who live different realities today, and I'm showing you this is what it means. Like someone like me with different psychiatric labels, this is how I'm often treated in a public hospital settings because I was being overwhelmed. I had a meltdown. So they needed 6 male police to sit around to watch me. This is just 3 years ago. This is not 20 years ago. I wasn't a witch that was being hunted, but I may as well have been. So the long haul graphs that there is, the so-called progression, I won't say the so-called progression. So what we are also seeing now that's happening is we are going back because there's a lot of unrest in the world. We want some form of control. We want some form of like, oh, when do we pray to God, right? When we are desperate and we're in crisis, right? So this is also a shift in how we are also going back to a lot of all these ideas because there's a lot of unrest in the world. People are uncomfortable. People need some form of order. So we go back to evidence that we had found from 20 years ago because conformity and information flow then was different. Lives of people were different. We had not catch up with the capacity of our physiology, of our mind spiritually, to also start to manage the modern life that we live today. So this is how we control people. This is how we control thoughts. And when we do this, what we then do is when we insist on conformity, when we insist that you have to be like that to exist in the world today, then you are silencing a very, very, very large group of people. You're silencing a lot of people who were never part of that route, who never had a chance to build their movement. So we are bringing them back whenever we go forward a step and we go forward 2 steps when we are going back in so-called progression. This is what it is. We control them. We have more mechanism to control them instead of allowing for these voices to start, telling their own stories. So which is also something that I often say. We This is Malaysia, right? Everybody look at Malaysia and think that Malaysia is full of diversity and forest, but we had start to then co-opt to a lot of homogeny even within our agriculture, how we want people, because this is actually developing nations. You're neither there because you need some form of a control, you need some form of power, you need some form of getting people to subscribe to a certain agenda because the international developmental goals have given you this. So we are planting a lot of trees that are similar, that feeds on the same thing, that are built in grids. And I always tell people that when you focus too much on what do you want to plant, when you focus too much on one tree, you are missing the forest for the trees. And that's why issues are siloed where treaty bodies are not understanding intersectionality. One of the biggest flaws that I am seeing right now is between CDOR and CRPD. Within CDOR, you don't have a lens of disability, even though your chairperson is a disabled woman. And within CRPD, gender there is so little gender perspective in the CRPD that we all simply think, and I see how this then translate even within the experts in my country who make claims that there is no difference in discrimination between a male, a disabled man and a disabled woman. And these are inputs that are recently had just been fed into regional papers, into research studies. And I'm upset because it's 2025 and these are things that we still hold true, because we had been so trained to look at homogeny and conformity of people, and we had looked at issues without drawing a plot line across them. So this is where I switch hats. And I think I look at things the way I do because I've been telling stories all my life. So I've been in media for almost 15 years. And how we collect our stories, and this is actually a real thing, a method that I use for my film, because I've been filming and I've been archiving myself for the last 15 years. So I'm looking at different archives and I'm pulling data from my own life. I'm pulling big teams from my own life and I have to put them together. The similar when we run research, right? We also need hypothesis by pulling in randomized data. Storytelling and running a research study and filmmaking is actually not much of a difference. So thank God I have a lot of job options, I hope. Uh, so, and everything has got to have a beginning, the middle, and an end. When you write a research study, you got to start somewhere with a hypothesis. You got to do your analysis, and then you got to have like an outcome. So what is it that you're trying to tell me? Similarly, when we make film, I got to tell you, this is my characters, this is the context of what she's living in. Now I want to analyze and show you what's happening in her life, and this is what I want you to walk out of the cinema thinking. I can't tell you, so every story has that. Little Mermaid found a guy she likes. She threw away her voice so that she can meet him, and then she go through all her turbulence because in the end she finally realized that true love doesn't need to change people, and she married her prince. So every Disney story is the same. Every research paper is also similar. Every filmmaking is similar. So why I'm bringing this up? Because I feel that in the field of research, because I've been looking at this for the last 5 years and policies, we are tell we are showing data, but we are not making data talk. We are not connecting what is this data telling you? What should this data inform the treaty bodies? Why are we reporting there are 16% of disabled people who identify with disability globally, but what does that mean? What are their lives? So storytelling, marrying them into what I feel is a narrative research field that I think is very, very important to that we start looking at, is because we need to start to humanize all the data points that we have been collecting, to cut through a lot of the jargons, to cut through a lot of the academic barriers, so that policies that we see, people like our beloved special repertoire actually understand the data that she's writing. And I'm giving a lot of these people in power the benefit of doubt that they actually want to do good. But because they are unable, they are so far removed from ground realities, they are at the ear part. They only hear what's been told and what's been amplified to them. So where can we fight back? How can we, within the other part, outside of research, the other different ways of conveying information, can help academics, can help policies to visualize this? How can we make data sing? So narrative research is something that I feel is the vision for what we should be looking at to make lived realities of people who with disabilities and gender diverse to really come together, so that you have different ways of conveying what you're experiencing in life. Because if you never had that voice, you will forever be invisible in the eyes of the international developmental plan. We're not part of the plan. We like to think that we are. I like to think that my life is being safeguarded, but the reality is no, it's not. So I call this reframing data justice. This is really something that I've been trying to like propose to a lot of people, because I think justice trumps for a lot of things. And justice is not meant to be a legal form of justice. Justice is about what's fair in life. Justice is about correcting inequality. Justice is also about how do we then make it fair for those who are furthest from the power, who are further who are living within the cycle of injustice, who are repeating themselves in this cosm. Like when you put a lot of mirrors against one thing, it just mirrors itself so far back, right? So if you have one problem within a certain community and you're only amplifying within its walls of mirrors, you are never going to break this glass ceiling. And I think that data justice, by reframing how we tell data, by reframing to look at source of data, to look at how do we change the ethics board's process of validating data, how do we accept papers within institutions, how do we accept papers for publication, how do we amend the process by reframing all this, you're actually giving hope to a lot of people who would never have the chance. A lot, it's very easy to say, well, let's wait for the next generation of disabled women who are in academic. By the time you wait for that, I'm dead, because my lifespan is 20 years shorter than a non-disabled woman. So we don't really have that time, which means intervention for processes needs to be done now. So in saying that, I'm all about power. I believe that all the problems that we have in global is about who holds the power. And I believe in the strength of having the narrative in your own hand. So, how do we shift that data? How do we bring justice to data so that we can help build for a better world through policies, through a lot of the agenda that we are doing in? Put the camera back into the person that needs to tell it. Put the microphone back into who needs to speak. Put the money to who should be speaking. Pay me, not pay a researcher to write about me. And I think these are the biggest thing that need to shift within what we are talking about within any form of research-based policies, the UN especially. I will flip if they keep paying consultants to pay for, to write about me when they could have just paid me. People are paying a lot of external consultants to write about unemployment, about persons with disabilities, and then they would then use persons with disabilities to be interviewed, and they don't even get like $10. So yeah, so think about that. So really, that's that. Sorry if I could really go on and on. Now I don't know how to stop my screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Beatrice. Was this your last slide?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this super insightful presentation. Barrett, we can stop the recording, maybe.
How do I stop the screen sharing?